February 22nd, 1996. Nashville, Tennessee. 18-year-old Melissa Chilton and 18-year-old Tiffany Campbell show up for work at Exotic Tan for Men, a tanning salon which doubles as an adult entertainment establishment, but they are stabbed a combined total of over 100 times in the laundry room. 17 years later, a suspect named Patrick Streater, who happens to be Tiffany's former boyfriend, is charged with both murders. However, in 2018, the authorities announced that new DNA testing has significantly weakened their case against Streater, making it impossible to take him to trial, so the murder charges are dropped and the tanning bed murders are never conclusively solved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be covering an unsolved double homicide, the 1996 murders of Melissa Chilton and Tiffany Campbell, aka the Tanning Bed Murders. This coming weekend, I'm going to be traveling to Nashville, Tennessee in order to be on Podcast Row at CrimeCon, and per tradition, whenever I attend a podcasting event, I always like to release an episode about a cold case from the event's host city that very same week. This is the disturbing story of two young women, Melissa Chilton and Tiffany Campbell, who were employed at a tanning salon called Exotic Tan for Men, which was actually an adult entertainment establishment in disguise, as both victims would perform stripteases for customers in the back rooms. While working a shift at the salon, Melissa and Tiffany were both brutally stabbed to death in the laundry room and had a combined total of over 100 stab wounds between them. For 17 years, investigators failed to uncover any solid suspects until one of Tiffany's former boyfriends, Patrick Streater, who happened to be serving time in a California prison for other crimes, was charged with both murders. The authorities waited for Streater to finish serving this sentence before they extradited him to Tennessee, but even though forensic evidence supposedly linked him to the crime, a decision was made to perform some more advanced DNA testing before they took him to trial. But the results did not turn out like the state expected, so they decided to drop the charges against Streater and release him from custody. It does not sound like Streater has been officially exonerated per se, but the case against him was hardly rock solid, so the state was reluctant to take him to trial with the evidence they had. For their part, Streater's defense team has attempted to point the finger at an alternate suspect who had also dated one of the victims and later went to prison for another murder. It's now been nearly 6 years since the charges against Streater were dropped, and the investigation seems to be in a holding pattern, but regardless of who the perpetrator was, this is still an incredibly disturbing crime involving two victims who have yet to receive justice, so I thought now would be a good time to do an episode. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. As our Patreon page has around 70 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the murders of Melissa Chilton and Tiffany Campbell. Our story begins in Nashville, Tennessee in 1996, and our two victims are 18-year-old Melissa Chilton and 18-year-old Tiffany Campbell. Melissa hails from the unincorporated community of Brush Creek and is currently a freshman psychology major who resides on campus at Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro. Tiffany lives with her mother and stepfather, and even though she has quit high school, she is working on obtaining her general education diploma. For the past 5 months, both women have been working at a tanning salon called Exotic Tan for Men, which is located on Church Street in Nashville. On the morning of Thursday, February the 22nd, Melissa and Tiffany showed up there to open for business, but during the late morning and early afternoon hours, the salon's owner, Keith Scott, made a number of phone calls to the establishment and kept getting no answer. Scott eventually decided to drive to the salon and arrived at around 2 p.m., but was surprised to discover that the front door was locked. After Scott unlocked the door and walked into the salon, he soon discovered the bodies of Melissa and Tiffany inside a laundry room located near the back of the building, which doubled as an employee break room, and both victims were lying in large pools of blood. The Metropolitan Nashville Police Department were summoned to the scene, and they soon discovered that between the two of them, Melissa and Tiffany had been stabbed a combined total of more than 100 times. A sheath ordinarily used to carry a military-style bayonet was discovered on the floor, and while the bayonet was believed to be the murder weapon, it was never found. It seemed apparent that when the perpetrator entered the salon, they locked the front door behind them and then left through the back door after committing the crime, which is why no customers showed up and discovered the bodies before Scott arrived. It appeared that the killer left in a hurry because there was no evidence to indicate they used the sink to wash blood off themselves. And surprisingly, even though the salon was adjacent to a restaurant and the killer likely would have been covered in blood, no witnesses reported seeing or hearing anything unusual. While the business was equipped with security cameras, the VCR was missing, as the perpetrator had unplugged it from the cameras and likely took the VCR with them when they fled the scene. Well, it turned out that Exotic Tan for Men doubled as an adult entertainment establishment, as ads featuring the salon's address and telephone number were run in numerous adult publications under the name Private Moments. The salon actually only had one tanning bed, but there were a total of 5 waiting rooms, which were each equipped with a love seat, and customers would sit there while the female employees danced and performed stripteases for them. Tiffany initially told her family that she was working at the salon as a receptionist, but did eventually admit to her mother, Deborah Edmonds, that she was a dancer there and had taken the job for the money. While Deborah was not exactly thrilled with this, Tiffany assured her that there was no touching allowed from the customers and she did not participate in any sex work. Ironically, only a few days before she was murdered, Tiffany had told Deborah that she was planning to quit her job because she did not have a car and the commute was too much trouble for her. And in another tragic turn of events, Tiffany had not been scheduled to work on the day of the crime and only came in after another employee asked her to cover their shift. By comparison, Melissa's family was completely unaware of her job at Exotic Tan for Men, and when the authorities informed them that she had been murdered there, they initially thought it must have been some sort of mistake, since they did not believe Melissa ever would have worked at a place like that. But some of Melissa's friends at university were aware of her job at the salon, and much like Tiffany, she had openly expressed her intention to quit in the days prior to the murders. According to Tiffany's mother, Gail Chilton, sometime in mid-February, she had a vivid, frightening dream that Melissa had been murdered. Gail was left so shaken by this that she felt compelled to drive from Brush Creek to Murfreesboro in order to surprise Melissa at her dorm and take her out to dinner. While they had a good time together, Melissa was murdered for real only 1 week later. Whenever customers frequented the salon, they were required to sign into a registration book at the reception area, and investigators used this book to track down the final customer who had signed in on the day of the crime. This person claimed that they left shortly before 11 a.m. and was able to confirm that the murders had not yet taken place and the 2 women were still there, and he was not considered to be a suspect. Since there were no signs of forced entry, the killer presumably arrived a short time later, meaning that Melissa and Tiffany may have been dead for as long as 3 hours before Keith Scott found their bodies. After customers paid for services, the money was instantly put inside a safe, but nothing was taken from it. While robbery did not appear to be the primary motive for the crime, the killer did steal Melissa's car keys and wallet, as well as Tiffany's identification, checkbook, and a Walkman she carried. A variety of pills and a small amount of marijuana were found at the salon, so the authorities could not rule out drugs as a possible motive. However, investigators were inclined to believe that the killer was not some random patron, but rather an individual that one or both of the victims knew. They suspected that the perpetrator was familiar with the layout of the building, and since Tiffany had a number of defensive wounds, they felt that she was likely the intended target, and Melissa was killed because she just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. The salon did have some customers who were known for having caused problems there in the past, but even though a number of these individuals were questioned, none of them stood out as potential suspects, and there was no evidence to implicate them. Melissa had a boyfriend at the time who was dismissed as a suspect, but as we're going to talk about momentarily, a couple of Tiffany's former boyfriends would eventually garner some attention in the investigation. The case would attain national exposure when it was featured on an episode of America's Most Wanted, which aired in February of 2000, but it failed to bring the case any closer to a resolution. Nashville Crime Stoppers would initially offer a $1,000 reward, but in February of 2006, on the 10-year anniversary of the murders, Gail Chilton held a press conference in which she announced that she was personally offering a $10,000 reward for information which led to the arrest and conviction of a suspect. Gail became a major advocate for her daughter, as she served on the board for the nonprofit organization Tennessee Voices for Victims, and also lobbied for the city of Nashville to draft stronger regulations and protections for employees at adult-oriented businesses. During one interview, Gail also mentioned that Keith Scott had left town shortly after the murders took place, and she expressed her belief that Scott may have known more than he was letting on. The actual circumstances of how Melissa and Tiffany got jobs at Exotic Tan for Men are unclear, but it's been reported that friends had recruited and coerced them into working there. It's also been alleged that Scott was trafficking some of his employees, a couple of whom may have been underage, and he also supplied them with drugs. While police described Scott as being cooperative with the investigation, they still considered him to be a person of interest, but years after the crime took place, Exotic Tan for Men would finally close down. The investigation would remain at a standstill for several more years, but on February the 21st, 2013, one day shy of the 17th anniversary of the crime, it was announced that a 37-year-old suspect named Patrick Streater had been indicted and charged with 2 counts of premeditated first-degree murder for the deaths of Melissa and Tiffany. Streater was a former track and football star at McGavock High School in Nashville, where he had been Tiffany's boyfriend, though they broke up a few years before the murders took place, and Streater was engaged to be married to another woman at the time. In fact, Streater even attended Tiffany's funeral and requested to place a rose in her hand while she was inside her casket. But it would later come out that another employee from Exotic Tan for Men claimed that on the day before the murders, Streater had walked into the salon looking for Tiffany and stormed out after learning she wasn't there. At the time this indictment was handed down, Streater was already incarcerated at the California State Prison in Solano County. Years earlier, Streater had been living in Citrus Heights with his wife and 2 young children, but when he lost his job as a security guard and went into debt, he did not tell his family about it. Instead, he would leave his home at night in order to work a so-called graveyard shift, when in actuality, he was committing a series of robberies, which involved stealing purses and breaking into homes and cars. Streater usually targeted elderly women and would often violently assault the victims when he stole from them. In March of 2002, he was finally arrested for these crimes, and after pleading guilty to a number of different charges, he received a 14-year prison sentence. The Metro Nashville PD always had Streater on their list of potential suspects for the tanning bed murders and even interviewed him a few times during the early stages of the investigation, but it took them over a decade in order to build a case against him. But in early 2013, the department's cold case unit finally presented evidence to a grand jury who elected to indict Streater for the crime. At the outset, investigators were tight-lipped about the evidence they had, only revealing that this indictment was made possible by scientific evidence, new interviews, and strong investigative work. However, a decision was made to allow Streater to finish serving his prison sentence in California before moving forward on the murder charges. As a result, another 2 years would pass, but once Streater's sentence was completed in August of 2015, he was picked up by Metro Nashville police detectives and extradited to Tennessee. Streater soon entered a not guilty plea to the charges and would be incarcerated in the Davidson County Jail to await trial. There would be a lot of legal wrangling over the next few years, and sadly, Tiffany's mother, Deborah Edmonds, would not live long enough to see her daughter's alleged killer stand trial, as in October of 2016, she succumbed to a fatal heart attack at the age of 62. In March of 2017, a hearing was held in Davidson County Criminal Court in which Streater's defense attorney, Kyle Mothershed, asked that the case be dismissed, arguing that the state had violated his client's right to a speedy trial by waiting 2 years to extradite him from California. Mothershed also argued that Streater had an alibi during the approximate time period the murders took place. On the morning of February the 22nd, 1996, Streater claimed he was at his mother's apartment over 10 miles away, and phone records would show that a 7-minute call was made from there at 11:22 a.m. to Streater's fiancée, who was living in Alabama at that time. Since the murders were believed to have taken place shortly after 11 a.m., Mothershed argued that this did not leave Streater with enough time to have committed the crime. Testimony was also presented at the hearing, which supposedly pointed towards an alternate suspect in the murders. The suspect in question was David Ewan, who also happened to be a former boyfriend of Tiffany's. Ewan had an extensive criminal history, and on the day before the murders, he was apparently released from jail while serving time for another crime. 2 years later, on March the 11th, 1998, when Ewing was 21 years old, he paid a visit to the Arbor East Apartments in Hermitage, a suburb of Nashville, and got into a heated confrontation with 53-year-old Richard Hicks over drugs and money. Things escalated to the point where Ewan fatally shot Hicks, shot and wounded one of Hicks's friends, and proceeded to rob them before fleeing the scene. 3 days later, Ewan wound up getting into a chase with the police while driving Hicks's stolen car, and even though he was shot in the back during the pursuit, Ewan managed to survive and was charged with criminal homicide, attempted criminal homicide, and aggravated burglary. At the hearing, Streater's defense team presented testimony from a prison inmate and career criminal named Quentin Hughes, who happened to be Ewan's cousin. Hughes claimed that he had been present when Ewan killed Richard Hicks, and when he asked Ewan how he was capable of doing something like that without remorse, Ewan supposedly confessed to having murdered Tiffany Campbell. Hughes acknowledged that Ewan technically never admitted to killing Melissa Chilton, though he did testify that Ewan had been very possessive of Tiffany when they were in a relationship. Testimony was also provided by a private investigator named Sarah Kingsbury, who had been hired by the defense, and managed to uncover a police interview which had been conducted with another former girlfriend of Ewan's named Melissa Dixon's after he was charged with Hicks's murder in 1998. Dickens claimed that around the time Hicks's murder took place, she saw him get mad and stab their bed with a knife, before he admitted that he had killed 2 young women. However, since Dickens was killed in a car accident in 2014, she was unable to provide any testimony to corroborate this story. Kyle Mothershed intended to call upon another inmate to testify that he had overheard Ewan confess to the murders, but this person refused to do so and decided to plead the Fifth Amendment in order to avoid possible self-incrimination. In the end, the Davidson County Criminal Court judge denied the defense's request to dismiss the case and also denied an additional request to reduce Streater's bond, as he did not believe the new testimony from Quentin Hughes and Sarah Kingsbury was strong enough evidence to do so. However, by November of that year, rumors started circulating that the forensic evidence used to indict Streater was nowhere near as strong as originally thought, so the state agreed to the defense's request to perform another round of forensic testing with newer, more advanced technology. They also agreed to reduce the cost of Streater's bond from $750,000 to $25,000, which his family was able to pay, so Streater was released from the Davidson County Jail and allowed to remain free while the testing took place. Well, 7 months later, on June the 29th, 2018, the Davidson County District Attorney's Office made a surprising announcement. They were going to be dropping the murder charges against Streater. After performing what he described as, quote-unquote, the most advanced scientific testing and DNA analysis of any case our office has handled, Deputy District Attorney Roger Moore also stated, quote, it would not be appropriate to proceed with the case against Mr. Streater in light of the current state of the evidence, end quote. It would later come out that one of the key pieces of evidence which led to Streater's indictment was a partial DNA sample taken from the knife sheath which was found in exotic tan for men near the victims' bodies. Streater's ex-wife had told investigators that he owned a military-style knife with a sheath that was identical to the one left behind at the scene, though Streater himself denied this. The initial round of testing on the DNA from the sheath showed what was described as a quote-unquote possible forensic link to Streater, even though it was apparently a lower probability. However, when the partial DNA sample was reanalyzed, one lab report stated that, quote-unquote, no conclusions could be made from it, as it had several contributors and was broken down and partially degraded. An analysis from a different lab report stated that Streater's DNA was still, quote-unquote, somewhat associated with the sheath, though it could hardly be described as conclusive. But the most important testing was performed on some DNA found underneath Melissa's fingernails, and it excluded Streater as being the contributor. For this reason, the state felt that the evidence was not strong enough to take Streater to trial, which is why they decided to drop the murder charges. His defense attorney, Kyle Mothershed, told the press that the DNA analysis had not only exonerated his client, but also implicated another man, though this is not exactly true. The authorities have never specifically stated that they have cleared Streater as a suspect and ruled him out as having any involvement in the crime, and while the DNA from under Melissa's fingernails was compared to David Ewan's DNA, the results were deemed inconclusive. Regardless, the Metro Nashville PD offered their assurances that they would continue to investigate the case and search for new evidence, and that it would remain open and active. As far as I can tell, there have not been any new developments during the past 6 years, and in February of 2023, Gail Chilton did an interview in which she urged the police to take a fresh look at the DNA evidence. But there is one final postscript to this story. On January the 16th of this past year, just 4 months before this episode's release, Patrick Streater was arrested in Seattle, Washington for allegedly attacking a young woman. He was charged with attempted rape in the second degree and unlawful imprisonment with sexual motivation, and at the time of this recording, he is yet to enter a plea or go on trial, and is currently being held on a $250,000 bond at the King County Jail. As for the murders of Melissa Chilton and Tiffany Campbell, it has been nearly 3 decades since the crime took place, and there are still no conclusive answers about who is actually responsible. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So there's nothing more frustrating than a case where the trail goes cold for several years and then heats up after an arrest is made, only for the trail to suddenly go cold all over again. And that's exactly what happened in this case, as it appeared that a suspect might finally face justice for the murders of Tiffany Campbell and Melissa Chilton until the charges against him were dropped before the case even went to trial. What's particularly frustrating here is that when Patrick Streater was indicted, the authorities were initially quite vague about the evidence they had against him, but they did give off the impression that they had linked him to the crime via DNA evidence. Even after the charges were dropped, investigators were still pretty vague about why they made this decision, only saying that the evidence against Streater wasn't as strong as they thought. It was only last year, when more specific details were released to the public, and we learned that Streater was charged because an older, degraded DNA sample from the sheath found at the murder scene had a quote-unquote possible forensic link to him, though it was described as being a quote-unquote lower probability. I'm sorry, but in recent years, we've seen genetic genealogy lead to the resolution of a number of cold cases in which DNA evidence has been linked to a suspect, and in many of those cases, the odds of the DNA belonging to anyone else are described as being in the quadrillions. So by comparison, charging someone because of a possible link to a DNA sample with several contributors is not going to cut it. When Gail Chilton did her interview last year, in which she asked investigators to take a fresh look at the DNA evidence, she made mention of the University of Idaho murders, which took place in November of 2022, and how hearing about that crime reopened some old wounds. As you probably know, the Idaho murders involved 4 students being stabbed to death in an off-campus residence, and a suspect named Brian Kohlberger was soon arrested for the crime. While he is yet to go on trial, one of the primary pieces of evidence against Kohlberger is the alleged presence of his DNA on a knife sheath found at the murder scene. So Gail said it was quite frustrating to hear about justice being served in this high-profile case because of a DNA sample from a sheath, yet the same piece of evidence wasn't good enough for a resolution in her daughter's murder. Now, the key difference is that there appears to be a ton of strong corroborating evidence against Brian Kohlberger besides the DNA, but that did not appear to be the case with Patrick Streater, as the state felt they would have been unable to secure a conviction if they took him to trial. In retrospect, it should have been a red flag that Streater was allowed to remain in prison for California for another 2 years after he was charged with the murders, so he could finish serving his previous sentence. In fact, during that 2-year window, Gail Chilton had petitioned the governor of California in an attempt to get him extradited sooner. And after he was brought to Tennessee, it would be nearly an additional 3 years before they decided to drop the charges. I'm sure this delay caused a lot of additional trauma for the victims' families and played a role in Tiffany's mother, Deborah Edmonds, succumbing to a heart attack in 2016. In fact, prior to her death, Deborah had attended a court hearing about the case and told Gail Chilton that she had uncontrollable shakes, stating, quote, "I can't do this anymore." Deborah passed away a short time later, and it's all the more tragic that she had to endure all this, and the end result was Streater becoming a free man again before he even stood trial. Last year, Tiffany's 90-year-old grandmother, Ernestine Revis, did her first ever interview with the media, in which she revealed that she spoke to her granddaughter on the phone the night before she was murdered. Ernestine expressed her own desire to see justice in this case, but who knows if she'll live long enough to see it. Now, after the charges were dropped, Streater's defense attorney, Kyle Mothershed, told the media that his client had finally been exonerated, but from a technical standpoint, he has never officially been cleared as a suspect. While the new DNA testing seemed to lean away from Streater, I do not believe his innocence was proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. I've already discussed the murkiness about his DNA supposedly being on the sheath, but what's more important is that there was DNA underneath Melissa's fingernails, and Streater was excluded as the contributor. So even if Streater was actually guilty of this crime, that detail alone would probably be enough to create reasonable doubt in a jury's minds if he ever went to trial, and likely would result in an acquittal. But theoretically, if new evidence did surface to implicate Streater, he could be charged with this crime again. Of course, I just mentioned that Streater has recently been rearrested for attempted rape, and he served time in prison for committing a number of robberies and assaults in California, so he's clearly not a good person. But does that necessarily mean he's a murderer? If you do a search on Streater's name at newspapers.com, you'll see him get mentioned in a lot of articles from the Nashville-based newspaper, The Tennessean, which chronicle his exploits as a high school football and track star during the 1990s. It sounds like he once had a promising future before everything went horribly wrong, and when he was arrested in 2002, a lot of people were taken by complete surprise, since he had helped coach freshman high school football and never gave off any warning signs of being violent. When Streater was sentenced for his crimes, he tried to tell the court that he was not a bad person, and only committed these robberies because he needed money to support his family. But that doesn't change the fact that he viciously assaulted a number of elderly women during these crimes, but when all is said and done, he did let them live. So would he have been capable of committing the tanning bed murders? Yes, Tiffany was his former girlfriend, but they had been broken up for years, so could he have still hated Tiffany enough to stab her and another innocent person a combined total of 100 times? Before I talk any more about potential suspects, I have to mention that during the early stages of the investigation, police were looking into possible connections with another case that I featured on episode number 227 of this podcast, and that's the murders of 22-year-old Candy Belt and 18-year-old Gloria Ross, a crime which is also known as the Kentucky Bordello murders. Both victims were employed at the New Life massage parlor in Oak Grove, Kentucky, and were killed there during the early morning hours of September the 20th, 1994, after being shot in the head and having their throat slashed. Since the crime occurred 17 months before the tanning bed murders, and Oak Grove is located about 60 miles from Nashville, next to the Tennessee-Kentucky state line, you can understand why investigators would have looked into possible links, but they ultimately concluded that the two cases were not connected. Even so, there are a striking number of similarities between them. Like Exotic Tan for Men, the New Life massage parlor was a front for adult entertainment, as the place was actually a brothel and the two victims were sex workers. Much like Melissa and Tiffany, Candy Belt and Gloria Ross were working alone at their establishment before they were killed during their shift, though the key difference is that the Bordello murders occurred in the middle of the night, whereas the tanning bed murders took place in broad daylight and were a lot more brazen. Another big similarity between the two cases is that they both contained an arrest but no conviction. Right from the outset, the prime suspect in the Bordello murders was a corrupt Oak Grove police officer named Ed Carter, and 19 years after the crime took place, Carter and two accomplices named Leslie Duncan and Frank Black were arrested and charged. I fully admit that I always used to believe that Carter was the guilty party, but to everyone's surprise, when DNA testing was performed on semen, which was found inside one of the victims' vagina and anal cavity, it did not match Carter or the other two defendants. So when the case went to trial, all three men wound up being acquitted. So the trail has once again gone cold in the Bordello murders case, and thus far, the DNA evidence has yet to be matched to anyone. And for all we know, perhaps the two victims were murdered by a completely random perpetrator who went to the massage parlor that night and never popped up on the radar as a suspect. Of course, double jeopardy means that Ed Carter, Leslie Duncan, and Frank Black can never be charged with the Bordello murders again, but since Patrick Streater never went to trial, the door is still open to recharge him with the tanning bed murders if new evidence surfaced which implicated him. Much like Carter, I'm sure that most people felt that Streater was the right guy when he was initially charged, but the lack of a conclusive DNA match has seriously complicated the case against him. I know that investigators were inclined to believe that there was no connection between the Bordello murders and the tanning bed murders, but given how both these investigations ultimately turned out, part of me wonders if there might have been some unknown serial killer in the Tennessee-Kentucky area during the mid-1990s who liked to murder women at adult entertainment establishments. The viciousness of these crimes gave off the impression that they were personal in nature, but if the perpetrator had no real connection to any of these women, and they were simply victims who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, then that could explain why it's been so difficult to solve these cases. One particularly tragic element about the Bordello murders and the tanning bed murders is that they each had two victims who didn't particularly like their jobs and were left in a very vulnerable position. While Tiffany's family eventually learned what she was doing, Melissa's family did not find out until after she was killed, and it's unclear why she took the job to begin with. And tragically, both women had expressed their plans to quit in the days prior to the murders, but they did not get out in time. Yes, the story goes that their work only involved dancing and stripping, and they supposedly did not make physical contact with the customers, but the tanning salon's owner, Keith Scott, definitely sounded like a shady character, as there were rumors surrounding him which involved drugs and trafficking. Until Streater was charged, it does not sound like Scott was completely ruled out as a person of interest, but while I don't have trouble believing that he was involved with some unsavory activities, they may have been completely unrelated to the murders. If Scott did not tell the police everything he knew, perhaps it was because he wanted to keep some of the other illegal things he was doing under wraps. I don't get the sense that Scott was personally involved in the murders, since he was the one who discovered the victims' bodies and phoned the police. And even if he had issues with Melissa and Tiffany, it doesn't make much sense to have them murdered inside his establishment while they're working, because that would completely destroy your business. I guess it's possible that the two women could have been killed over something that Scott was involved in and were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, but if that's the case, the crime was major overkill. I suppose it's possible that due to the so-called rules about no physical contact between employees and customers, one of the clients may have tried to make a move on the women and turned violent when he was rejected, but I still tend to believe that the perpetrator had some sort of personal grudge against one or both of the victims. It is true that a lot of the personal items that Melissa and Tiffany were carrying wound up being stolen from the scene and were never recovered, but this may have been an attempt by the killer to throw off the investigation and give off the false appearance that the motive for the crime was robbery. But the issue is that nothing was stolen from the salon's safe, and since it was apparently policy for employees to immediately put money inside after transactions with customers, I have to assume that Melissa and Tiffany had the combination. I do not believe that two victims are going to get stabbed a combined total of 100 times over a robbery, so the crime definitely seemed personal, but were the murders premeditated? But were they an unplanned crime of passion, which came about when things escalated out of control? Well, even though the murder weapon was never recovered, the sheath found at the murder scene was ordinarily used to hold a military-style bayonet, which does not sound like a weapon you would just be casually carrying around with you during a routine visit to a tanning salon. So if the killer brought it with them, then I think that's a sign that they were always planning to use it on someone. However, the fact that they left the sheath behind could be seen as a sign that they were inexperienced at this sort of thing and left the scene in a hurry. But on the other hand, they did have the wherewithal to take the VCR with them when they fled the place, which is why no footage of them could be found from the security cameras. This does suggest that the killer had some familiarity with the layout of the salon and had been there on a previous occasion. They also knew that the building had a back door which they could use to leave. If they had exited out the front door onto a public street in broad daylight, they likely would have been covered in blood and captured the attention of eyewitnesses, but surprisingly, nobody reported seeing or hearing anything unusual. If they were able to leave the scene undetected, I'm guessing that they must have had a vehicle parked somewhere nearby. Right from the outset, investigators were inclined to believe that Tiffany was the intended target, while Melissa was murdered because she just happened to be there, and this theory does make sense, considering that two of the most prominent suspects were ex-boyfriends of Tiffany's. But were either of them familiar with the layout of exotic tan for men? Well, one of the other employees claimed that on the day before the murders, they witnessed Patrick Streater come into the salon and ask for Tiffany, but he stormed out once he learned she wasn't there. I believe this eyewitness account was one of the pieces of evidence used to indict Streater, but given how the case against him ultimately turned out, I do question the validity of it. Even though Streater had dated Tiffany during high school, they had apparently been broken up for a while, so would he have even known that she was working at Exotic Tan for Men at that point, let alone take the initiative to track her down there and kill her? Another complication is that Tiffany was not even originally scheduled to work on the morning of the murders, but was asked to cover another employee's shift. If Tiffany was the intended target, would the killer have even known she would be there that day? If the other employee had shown up and worked the shift instead, would things have turned out differently? There's also the fact that Streater apparently had an alibi placing him at his mother's apartment on the morning of the murders, as phone records confirm that he made a 7-minute call from there to his fiancée in Alabama at 11:22 a.m. Of course, I don't think you could consider this an airtight alibi, since the two women's bodies were not discovered until around 2 p.m., and we still don't know the exact time they were killed. But we do know that the last customer who visited the salon that morning confirmed that Melissa and Tiffany were still alive when he left shortly before 11 a.m. And since there were no more names signed in the registration book, I think it's safe to assume that the two women were killed shortly after 11 o'clock, and the perpetrator locked the front door to prevent any more customers from walking inside. While I don't know the exact address of Streater's mother's apartment, it was described as being in the area near Percy Priest Lake, which looks to be at least a 20-minute drive away from Church Street, where Exotic Tan for Men was located. It seems very unlikely that Streater would have committed the murders and then rushed to his mother's apartment in time to make his 11:22 a.m. phone call, so if he was guilty, he would have needed to do this after the call. And that means the earliest Streater could have left his mother's apartment was 11:30, and it would be around noon at the minimum before he made it to the tanning salon. So would the salon really have been open for an entire hour without any other customers showing up during that time frame, or any other transactions taking place? I'd be curious to know if anybody tried entering the salon between 11 a.m. and noon and discovered the front door was locked. Because if it was, then that means the murders had already taken place, and it would have been impossible for Streater to commit this crime. I previously discussed the issues with the so-called match between Streater's DNA and the sheath, but quite frankly, I'm not sure if the DNA evidence on the sheath is strong enough to prove anything due to its age and possible cross-contamination. This type of DNA analysis is far more useful at excluding suspects rather than directly implicating them, and like I said earlier, if there had been additional corroborating evidence against Streater, I might put more stock into the forensic testing on the sheath, but overall, there really wasn't much there. Personally, I think it's much more important that Streater was excluded as being the contributor of the DNA found under Melissa's fingernails, as I think there's a much stronger chance that it belongs to the killer. It's also worth noting that the cold case investigator who obtained Streater's original indictment in 2013 was Detective Sergeant Pat Postiglione, a respected 30-year veteran who retired just over 1 week later, and eventually went on to become the subject of an investigation true crime TV series titled Deadly Recall. So I'm wondering if perhaps he might have prematurely jumped the gun on Streater because he wanted to cap off his career by getting one final unsolved cold case off the books on his watch. So the individual who has been pushed forward as the most compelling alternate suspect is David Ewan, another ex-boyfriend of Tiffany's who wound up going to prison for another murder just 2 years later. I looked up Ewan's criminal record online, and while I believe he has completed serving his sentence for the murder of Richard Hicks, he has continued to get into trouble with the law and been rearrested for other crimes such as aggravated burglary. It's not unreasonable to believe he could have been responsible for the tanning bed murders, but the problem is that the only real evidence against him is testimony from his cousin, Quentin Hughes. I've also looked up Hughes' criminal record online, and he's got a long rap sheet, so I can understand the credibility issues with him. Ewan also allegedly confessed about the murders to another inmate who pleaded the fifth rather than testify, as well as a former girlfriend who is no longer alive to corroborate the story, so there really isn't any evidence linking Ewan to this crime other than a bunch of hearsay. And when his DNA was compared to the DNA under Melissa's fingernails, the results were inconclusive. Of course, inconclusive is still different than excluded, so I certainly can't rule him out. Much like with Streater, I would really like to know more details about what his relationship was like with Tiffany. Did the relationship end on such bad terms that he would be enraged enough to commit murder in such a brutal fashion? Since he did the same thing with Richard Hicks, Ewan was obviously capable of violence, but if he was responsible for the tanning bed murders, he didn't leave any real evidence behind, even though he only would have been 19 years old at the time. In recent years, Gail Chilton has publicly urged the authorities to retest the DNA, and I would certainly like to see that, as I believe the last DNA analysis took place right before genetic genealogy became a tool in criminal investigations. I just hope that investigators have not developed tunnel vision and are still clinging to the belief that Streater was the right guy all along, because if he's not, they may be ignoring other potential leads. If the murders were committed by a suspect who has never popped up on the radar, perhaps genetic genealogy could link this crime to them. However, it's possible that the quality of the DNA evidence may not even be that strong, so this crime may have to be solved through other means. So, if by chance you happen to have any information about the murders of Melissa Chilton and Tiffany Campbell, please contact the Metro Nashville Police Department's Cold Case Unit at 615-862-7329. That's 615-862-7329. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 6 years, our Patreon page has released nearly 70 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about the disappearance of Dee Dee Rosenthal, who was the apparent victim of a murder, but even after her supposed killer confessed, her remains were never found. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my two co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, cover a very odd missing persons case, the 1998 disappearance of 98-year-old Walter Dunson. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 60 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give another shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Hatchetface, The Op Shop, Martin R., Dave L., Julie W., Weldon, Andrea S., Steve H., and Stacy C. Thank you all so much for your support. Anyway, even though you all know that I'll be at CrimeCon this weekend, I also wanted to mention that I've been booked to appear at this year's CrimeCon UK event, which is taking place at 133 Houndsditch in London on September the 21st and 22nd. If you would like to purchase tickets, we have a specialized promo code to get a 10% discount, so please visit crimecon.co.uk and use the promo code COOL24. Once again, that's crimecon.co.uk, and the promo code is COOL24 for 10% off tickets to both events. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. So I hope to see some of you in Nashville this weekend, but if not, have yourselves a great week, and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.